decided that was enough. This, again, was part of a clinical study. I found it to be incredibly beneficial. I mean, I thought I was a nice guy before, but it made me not afraid to feel feelings. And I think before that, I could feel from the neck up and from the waist down, but I had this block. And I remember taking MDMA. There's a physician there. They're talking to you. And all of a sudden, I felt like, now I sound like a crazy person, but this is how it felt from a sensation perspective, as if like my body had been in saran wrap before and it just kind of unzipped. And from that point on, I've sort of been able to feel things body-wide. And then I started thinking about all sorts of things like, wow, I have an unusual number of deaths and losses in my life for somebody who wasn't in the military or didn't grow up in the inner city. It just had some bad luck, knew people that had bad luck. And all of a sudden I was able to kind of digest that and think about it in a more reasonable way. I think before that I was just pack it away, just work, ignore it, or try and sublimate it or turn it into anger or fuel, which, it can be its own use, as you know. But at some point I was like, I think I need to actually spend some time on this. And I think it made me a nicer person to myself.
Yeah, I think there's real benefit in those things, whether it's MDMA or psilocybin. I think there's real benefit in a lot of them. And I think there's definitely benefit in macro, but I think there's benefit in micro too. I know a lot of people that microdose and they just feel like an elevated mood all throughout the day. I don't think you're going to get these sort of transformative, life-changing experiences where you transcend whatever it means to be a person and get a chance to look at yourself and look at the way you interface with reality in a different way. But I think what it does do is it alleviates a certain amount of anxiety and tension for people, and it allows them to have a more enjoyable experience just in like regular everyday life without being intoxicated. That's the key. It's like it doesn't change the way your motor functions are, doesn't change your visual. Well, it just actually improves your visual, which is really weird. I forget who the scientist was, but he did a study on being able to recognize whether or not it was like edge detection and being able to recognize the changing in parallel lines. And he did it. See if we can find out who this scientist was. But he was a very straight-laced scientist. He wasn't a whack job. And his joke was, it seems like you can detect reality better when you're high than when you're not high. Because people that were on psilocybin were able to detect, so if you have two parallel lines and they move one slightly off parallel, the people on psilocybin were able to detect it quicker than the people that were sober.
I believe that for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, psilocybin at a basic level, when we think of it as like a drug, but it's like, in many ways, it's a lot like the so-called SSRIs, like Prozac, Zoloft, and those things, in that they work on serotonin. It mainly increases serotonin, but different receptors than things like Prozac and Zoloft. The ability to, we call that a psychophysics experiment. They'd vary that ever so slightly, as you described. The thresholds for that are going to be different for different people, but if anything that can more narrowly tune attention is really going to help. I was surprised to learn this. I'd be curious what your thoughts are. I'm not a cannabis smoker. I just never really liked it. But I had a guest on my podcast named Paul Conti. He's an MD, mainly works on trauma, incredible trauma therapist, and has written about trauma, wrote the book on trauma that I think is the one in my opinion. And then we got into a discussion about like different substances and do they have application. So we talked about ketamine, et cetera. Asked about alcohol, just by way of comparison. And he said, there are basically zero therapeutic uses for alcohol, right? Therapeutic.
Right.
But then I asked about cannabis. Now, this isn't something he does in his own clinic. He does talk therapy, not drug therapy. Although he's a psychiatrist, so he can prescribe things. And he said, cannabis is interesting and it may actually have some therapeutic potential, but the main effect of cannabis is to narrow attention and focus. It actually can increase attention and focus. Now, the problem is it's not a very good filter, so people can narrowly attend to just video games or just to their anxiety if they're already anxious. That's a problem. But when it comes to psilocybin seems to increase creative thinking, new rules and algorithms about what could be an answer. So I'm not aware of how it might directly impact visual perception unless it narrows focus. But most of the drugs that impact serotonin are going to increase focus to some degree or another. And that can be good if what you're focusing on is pleasant. It can be really bad if what you're focusing on is really unpleasant. I knew people I'm sure you don't, who just smoke weed and they have a panic attack.
Yeah,
right?
the smoke weed thing is a weird one because it's like many things. It's completely dependent upon the individual, like their individual genetics, their biology, whatever it is that they've had in their past. I know people that smoke marijuana and they're high functioning, and I know people that smoke marijuana and they don't get anything done. And I don't know if they're related. Those two things are related. I think people who generally have drive and discipline, marijuana gives them a break. It gives them a nice just a little rest stop. And I think that's probably beneficial. And I also think it makes you a little kinder, a little more compassionate, a little more sensitive, which is probably very beneficial to someone who's hyper-focused. Like people that are like type A personalities and trying to get things done all the time. You smoke a little pot and you're like, what am I doing? Like, let's fucking relax a little. And then you get back to it. You're all right. I think there's a great benefit to that. But I should also say that it's very popular in the jiu-jitsu world.
Oh, yeah. I always thought that had something to do with the kind of creativity part of it. Like that you can't plan jiu-jitsu.
Right.
You have to improvise.
Yeah,
it's like jazz.
In a lot of ways. There's definitely that, but it's also the focus thing, that you're only thinking about that. Like while you're rolling, you're really only thinking about rolling. While you're smoking cannabis and then rolling, you're hyper-focused on it.
And physical strength, you feel fine. You don't feel lethargic or anything.
No,
like
not
that.
at all. I actually enjoy it. I actually enjoy it when I lift weights too.
Oh, I haven't tried that
Yeah,
one.
I feel it. Like I feel it in the fibers. It's almost like I'm more aware of like what's going on instead of like this blunt sort of almost like distance from each individual muscle fiber, which I am normally. Normally, I'm just trying to warm up, and then I warm up, and then I start getting going, and then I, lift light first, and then I work my way up to what I normally use. But when I'm high, it's like I could feel like where it connects to the bone. I feel everything. It just makes you more sensitive about what you're actually doing. And for martial arts techniques, particularly for striking, I feel like I incorporate leverage better into things. I have better balance in terms of like not trying to execute a technique when I'm off position, and it just makes me just more aware of like what's going on with my body.
And that's super powerful. We had the nerd in me wants to say in neuroscience they call that